Thing. Thank you, Zoom. That's a wonderful new feature. Now everybody knows that it's being recorded. All right. So welcome everyone to this 10th session of the Thought Leadership for Systems Transformation program. And it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Dave Snowden today as our guest teacher. So we'll hear from Dave. Dave will share his reflections and response to the collective narrative for maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have our Q&A section. And for that, if you have any questions as Dave speaks, you can post these questions in the chat. I will call on you to ask a question. Um, as always, we will prioritize people who haven't asked questions before or asked fewer questions than others. And then we will prioritize questions over comments. Okay, so if you have anything to say and anything to ask, please post that in the chat. And also you can use chat for communicating with each other as well. All right. Any questions? That's good. Good to go. Oh, awesome. So Dave, the mic is yours now.
Okay. So first of all, no problem in you using it. I don't think I've ever censored a podcast in my life. So I'm not going to start with you guys, I don't think. Okay, so several comments on this. There was a series of comments about the degree of expertise needed to understand things like Cynefin, and also a question about elite. We had that once. I remember in Singapore, I was presenting to the senior civil servants, and there was a group of them who thought Cynefin was far too intellectual and difficult and they shouldn't have to deal with it. So I got a bunch of 16-year-olds from Assumption English High School, to come in and present the framework to them after half an hour's been taught by their teacher. And they did a brilliant job and showed how it made sense of education and what they were doing. And not a single civil servant dared said it was too intellectual after that. That was a clear demonstration, right? The sort of basic, and particularly if you move on to the three domain version of Cynefin, which is where we normally start, order, complex, chaos, it's fairly easy to get people to understand that and to use it. So it's taught at command level in all the US military armed forces. We've had police officers in Florida scratch it on the back of a wall and talk with a SWAT team about what it means. So I think I'll push back on that and basically say, sorry guys, if you think this is hard, then probably you need to go back and do your primary school education again. Or you're making it too complicated. You're trying to make it into something which is actually not as simple as it is. And one of the reasons the children's party story is so popular is that we all deal with complexity on a day-to-day basis. We don't manage children's parties with KPIs and objectives and structured processes. We kind of like ad hoc it, and we manage constraints and boundaries and probes. So complexity is something we all know how to do, and it's not difficult. Right? I think, and there's a wider issue on that. If you look at our work with SenseMaker, for example, which is heavily focused on epistemic justice. So we've done work there with young kids in Africa who've been subject to genital mutilation and rape. And they've been acting as ethnographers to people at risk of the same horror within their own communities. And they've captured that story as ethnographers with minimal training. They've then been able to use that data collectively to ask people in their own village, how do we create more stories like this, fewer stories like that? But critically, they own the interpretation of their own data. Some sidelines on that which are quite interesting. So we did that project. We then got a group of stories indexed by a group of kids in Africa in a similar way and represented it to experts on gender in New York, The Hague, and London, got them to interpret it, and then showed them the difference in the interpretation. So this is a sidebar to the main question, but that was fascinating because there were three reactions. One was, oh my God, we don't see it the same way as them, and that's just stupid, because the only way you'd see the data the same way is if you had a horrific operation performed on you when you were young and then were raped, so you haven't got that same experience. The other scary one was they don't understand their own stories. They've interpreted it wrongly. The reality is different perspectives give you what's called a gradient in complexity, and that allows you to see differences. and I will now get slightly elitist and say what gradients do is they prevent equiprobability of outcome. So what a gradient does is it forces difference into the system, so you see things differently. So the issue about elite use of that material, kind of like, I'm going to push back. There were several questions about trust. I think trust is one of those interesting things. I mean, trust is something which takes years to accumulate and can be lost in seconds. And you don't trust people because an organization says you should. In fact, if anything, that probably causes you to trust them less. I'm not sure the degree to which trust is critical in any of the Cynefin domains. I'll say that with some qualification. So, for example, I have a reasonable amount of trust that nobody since I left home has changed the law of England so that I'm meant to drive on the right-hand side of the road when I go back. So there's a degree in the order of trust in stability, of predictability by consensus of various types. And I'm currently on antibiotics because I managed to get a sort of poisoned foot. And I can reasonably trust the doctor because that's institutional trust. I know that person has qualifications and so on and so forth. So trust in order is about predictability, institutions, and process. When you get into the complex domain, that's much more contextual. Like everything in complexity is deeply contextual. Nothing is context-free. So one of the reasons we do a lot of work to create informal networks in organizations is informal networks actually have high levels of trust, which aren't predetermined. You only form an informal community with people you trust in the context of that community's work. But in a crisis, you trust people who you normally hate, so everything can change. So I think trust has ambiguity and it differs by domain, but it's not a precondition in terms of the way it works. And I'll finish on the most controversial one, but there was a question about liminality and pain. To be in a liminal state is not necessarily to be painful. I thought that was a rather odd comment, so I wouldn't mind somebody talking it through in one way. Liminality is a state of suspended transition. It means you're not in one space or another. And liminality is where you're deliberately holding that space so you keep possibilities open in the future. Now, that might be painful for some people, but it's not necessarily painful. So, and any domain, any subdomain, any activity can be painful if you work at it, but it's not essential in liminality. In a sense, it may actually avoid pain, or it may get, by giving you more options. Linked with VUCA, I think VUCA is a way of describing a situation. They don't use complexity in the same way Cynefin does. I could do a VUCA map. I think I did one at one point, mapped it onto domains, but I eventually decided it was kind of like more or less irrelevant. If people wanted to use VUCA to say we live in a difficult, uncertain world, that was fine by me. But just calling it VUCA wasn't a sense-making technique, so it didn't help us in terms of making sense, whereas some of the other things did. And hierarchical complexity, it's there's a whole body of stuff which seeks to create predictability about complexity. I think hierarchical complexity is not the same thing as what we talk about in terms of entanglement. But multi-level things, I don't really want to go there. I would say, people want to carry on talking about hierarchical complexity, fine. But I don't think that language is particularly helpful for complexity coming from the natural sciences. And there was a wider question about, I think I was accused of intellectual arrogance, which I have no problem in taking as an accusation. I think there are different ways in which you disagree with people. So there are some things which are just self-evidently wrong, and they need to be called out. So, for example, Myers-Briggs personality tests are clearly established as a pseudoscience. There's no justification in their use. They're generally used as a control mechanism. Similarly with neuro-linguistic programming, these are established as pseudosciences. They haven't got replicability of evidence. The literature is fairly clear on the subject, so I think it's perfectly reasonable to condemn them. I think there's then a body of knowledge which is outdated, so or is constrained. So there's nothing wrong with Newton's laws of physics until you hit quanta, and then it doesn't work anymore. And there's a lot of things in systems thinking which kind of like within a specific context will work, but won't generalize much beyond that. And then there's this sort of element of we move on, right? So, for example, mental models and single and double loop learning was quite a cute concept back in the 70s and 80s. It helped us explain the world. It was extremely useful. I used it a lot. But we know a hell of a lot more about cognitive neuroscience, about the way people make decisions, about the way learning is collective as well as individual. We just know more, so we can move on from that way of thinking and think about something different. But if you're going to do something new, it's critical that you establish these differences, because otherwise people will fit within the old pattern. So one of the dilemmas of anybody who wants to do something novel is if you don't make it very distinctive, people will just see it as more of the same. And then there comes a point where things are starting to scale, where you kind of like have to be a little bit more open. But making distinctions, to my mind, is really important, and grown-ups can handle it. And having an ongoing debate with Michael Jackson at the moment, and it's a grown-up conversation. We both think each other is wrong. Sooner or later, he'll realize that I'm right, and he probably thinks the same about me, and there's no problem with that, right? So I think we should be far more accepting of debate than we actually are. There is this sort of new age fluffy bunny desire to homogenize things and say that all concepts are equally right and you should never challenge anything. But sorry, I come from a scientific background and I just don't buy that. Yeah. And the final point I want to make on play is play like trust is, yeah, play's good. We have a game called Anthro Simulation, which is designed to get people to think about complete novelty. We use cartoons, we use archetypes, we use symbols. Yeah. Play is one of the things that we can do which has utility. It's no more or less privileged than other techniques. It's a useful one in context. So that was from some brief notes I wrote when I had power and could look at the document. And I haven't had a chance to revisit it since I saw it this morning. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, David. That's great. And let's just take a moment and think about any questions you might have and post them in the chat. And then I'll call on you to ask your question. Dave, it's a little bit of like opening marketplace in open space setting. So we'll wait until questions start appearing there. And
I can be very rude about open space if you want.
Right. No, it's part of part of what we're trying to do is to bring different perspectives, and looking forward to Nora Bateson next week as well, especially.
Oh, you got Nora.
Say it again.
You got Nora.
Yep, next week.
Yeah, Nora. She and I are working on doing a webinar at the moment because we're both getting totally pissed off with anally retentive, autistic IT people who think they can write algorithms to handle democracy. So we may be about to do a joint webinar on that one.
Yeah, we kept you and Nora for the end of the program, just like when you saw.
Yeah, Nora's using me as a Rottweiler. So I'll take them on direct in social media. She just encourages me with DMs in the background and lets me take the hit.
Yeah,
but it's interesting. My daughter, who works for me as an anthropologist, she's just done the warm data course, and we're currently working on a Cynefin warm data. Not an integration, but more a work in what's coherent. The theory is the same, but the practice is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We heard from Nora. Tatiana and I went through the warm data course, so we're on the community. That's cool. Awesome. So everybody, if you want to, yeah. Okay. So we have the first question from Robert. So Robert, if you can unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be awesome. You're still muted.
There. I'm just curious, maybe this has nothing to do with today's conversation, but what's the nature of your debate with Michael Jackson?
Okay, so we both have positions at Hull University, right? Mike is the inheritor of Peter Checkland, and I work with Peter Checkland stuff a lot. We're both Lancaster University graduates as well, so we have that in common, and we're both pretty irascible in the way we work, right? So Mike wrote a critical article about the European Field Guide. And Mike is coming from a systems thinking perspective, and he's in that group of systems thinkers who think there's nothing in complexity they haven't already addressed. So generally, if you read Mike's stuff at the moment, and I'm saying this with a slight smile on my face, there's absolutely nothing anybody else has done which couldn't have been done better with critical systems theory. So why don't we just go in this course and do it, right? So either way, he said Snowden has taken a scientific approach and rejected humanities. So I wrote back and said, well, we're using Derrida and Deleuze and Habermas, and kind of like they fit within that. We're not using the same people you use in the humanities, but we're saying science is a constraint. So we're saying if we know something about human perception, we should accept it as a constraint. We shouldn't try and work around it. And I still haven't got him to understand that. That's one of the things we're going backwards and forwards on. And the critical thing, I think the difference is, I think that if you need to get more sophisticated. So if you look at the whole field of systems thinking, you've got the cybernetics guys. And I sort of feel sorry for them these days because they're sort of stuck in a paradigm and they can't break out of it. And certainly Nora's father was never in cybernetics, as you see it in second order level and the stuff with Philip and people like that. But the Checkland people are actually quite interesting because they have got workshop methods. They do try and address complexity. But the point I've made to him and Gerald Midgley in both cases is we addressed gravity as a race before Newton came along. But after Newton came along, we could do more with it. And you guys have been addressing complex problems for most of your lives, but now we've got complexity science. It's the same thing. We can now understand more about it. Yeah? I think the other difference we've got is that, to my mind, one of the big problems with systems thinking is all of their methods start with a workshop done by a facilitator where they agree how things should be, and then try and close the gap. And they've had 30 years now, it hasn't made much difference. What we do in complexity is we start with a description of the present and we identify which pathways forward have coherence. And that's a very different approach. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Dave. And we have a question from Flora, and then Tatiana, and then Ken. Flora?
So this is sort of a tactical question, only because I'm a consultant and guilty myself. But I've noticed that when people encounter frameworks like Cynefin, they take it as a Bible, and they often, will look at your quadrant, and if it doesn't fit there, they try and finesse it in ways that maybe are not useful. Meaning, we're always trying to fit it into a mold of something we're familiar with. And so how do we, if we're going to practice and we're going to encourage people to able to use the power of the Cynefin thinking, how do we release ourselves from that need to, and I don't even know what to call it, that there's that behavioral response to go back to the familiar all the time. I'm just curious.
And you can't stop that. I mean, one of the ways is you don't allow people to talk about quadrants when you're dealing with a 5-domain model. There can't be 5 quadrants mathematically. And it's amazing how often people forget about that middle space. They immediately fit it into a 2x2 matrix, and then they quite rigid. And they also decide that things are chaotic, which are not. So, for example, traffic in Mumbai is not chaotic, it's complex. I mean, I go to Mumbai. If I walk in a straight line across the road at a constant space, nothing will hit me. All right. So that's a complex system because the agents are adjusted. And to some extent, you just live with it. I mean, I would normally start with the 3-domain model. If we're working with people as a consultant, we use training data sets, so things like film scenes or book scenes, in what's called the 3-point method. So they actually construct the framework from that data. And then they've defined the domains and they've defined the boundaries by something which is independent of their situation. And we use that to come across. That's kind of like a metaphor-based approach. Yeah. And that works quite effectively. We also, if we're working with sense makers, so for example, if we've got leaders keeping leadership journals and interviewing other people, remember that thing I talked about in Africa, where we said they index it like this, you index like that. What do you think that means? And all of our, and one of the bodies of work I developed is called complex facilitation. It's something we teach. And I did the initial work when I was in IBM, and I did it all in Denmark. So I could facilitate in English and they would speak in Danish because I didn't want to understand what they were talking about. Yeah, my role was to facilitate a process. And if I could hear what they said, I could influence it, which I didn't want to do. So one of the things in complex facilitation is to put people in position where they see things from different perspectives. And this is what is now the central domain of Cynefin, which is the aporetic domain. And remember, aporia, if we go back to Derrida, Derrida famously says, a question is not a question. If you know the answer, it's a process. A question is only a question where you don't know the answer. So consultancy practice in Cynefin is to get people to ask themselves questions they can't answer, which puts them in a different space so they start to see things differently. The other more general thing is complexity is taking off at the moment. That's why Michael Jackson and everybody else in systems thinking, having ignored us for years, are suddenly trying to say we're doing the same thing, right? And that's what happened with systems thinking when it took off in the 80s and replaced scientific management, right? There's a time where the old paradigm stops working and the new paradigm will start to come through. And that's where we are at the moment. So there's less of a problem with the simulation, and certainly post-COVID, even less. So one of the things I've advocated now for 30 years is that informal networks are more important in companies than formal systems. And if you build the right informal networks, an informal network effectively is a information knowledge-free communication channel. So formal systems, the communication channels are designed to convey certain types of information. So in a crisis, they're inhibited by that, whereas the informal network isn't inhibited. Yeah. So it's a context-free communication channel. Now, I was on call before this, well, several hours before we still had power, to one of the world's biggest oil companies. Yeah. And starting to design a program to network their executives informally in order to handle uncertainty. Now, that was inconceivable before COVID. I'd be laughed out of the door. Mm. But now they're starting to take things seriously. So it's a lot easier than it was. But the principle of complex facilitation is get people to work out things for themselves, don't tell them. Because if you tell them, they won't listen anyway. And a lot of consultants can't cope with that. They like to be the authority. Particularly if they come from McKinsey's, then they have other psychological problems I don't want to talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. So Tatiana, it looks like Dave answered your question as well, or do you have any follow-up question? Yeah.
I'm not sure it's a follow-up question, but yeah, I think you did. You mentioned the gradient in your earlier, so, and how it helps people see different perspectives. So if you can elaborate on that, it would be helpful.
Yeah, well, I gave you that one example, and we do quite a lot of that with narrative. So if you give people a body of narrative, or micro narratives they are, and say, index that the way you think these people who you're responsible for indexed it. And then you say, well, they did it like this, you did it like that. What does that mean, right? That creates an epistemological tension, which they can't resolve. They can't say they got it wrong. I mean, I've had people do that, but then they realize it's a bit stupid to say people can't index their own stories. So they're forced to face up to something, right? We do the same with archetypes. So did this again in Denmark, all right? So we were working with board of a big pharmaceutical company. And I knew we were going to have problems because when the CEO briefed me on the project, he said, my staff all loved me and were seen as a progressive story. And when CEOs say that, you know you're going to have problems, right? So we end up on this remote island in the middle of Copenhagen harbor in winter. So there's no escape route. You should die if you tried to swim. 2 ferries a day. And we produced archetypal characters, the employees' archetypes of managers. This is a 2-stage process. It's based on complexity theory. We end up with cartoon characters with descriptions. Yeah, and we did that in China. We did it in the UK. We did it in Denmark. We combined the results. So we got one more of these. And then we ran through exactly the same process over 2 hours with the executives and produced their archetypes of the company. Now, the employees' archetypes were things like the tyrannical executive, the oppressed employee, the neglected employee, yeah, the ignorant. I mean, they were pretty bloody negative. And the board's ones were the inspirational executive, the cooperative employee. I mean, the contrast was huge, right? So we put them in this room and said, that's what you did, that's what they did, what did you think? And 2 seconds later, I suddenly, in pain because this massive bloody Dane had picked me up by my lapels. And I was 35 kilograms heavier then and slammed me against the wall so my feet are dangling. And said, how dare you say our staff feel like that? He said, they don't, I can tell you. And, this guy's got a genetic history of rape and pillage against the Celts. So, I'm nervous at this point, right? And I said, that process we took you through, did we influence you? And he said, no, because we spoke in Danish. I said, that's what we did with your staff. Now, at that point, he just dropped me, right? And they spent 4 hours talking about it because we didn't come in as consultants and say, this is the issue. We faced them with differences. And the process, because they'd been through the same process, they couldn't challenge the results. And that created that sort of apparatic moment. Yeah.
Great, awesome, David. Thank you. So, Ken, next.
Hi, Dave. Many, many moons ago, I was on a YTAN call with you and Jerry Mikowski right after you had published the HBR article where you talked about how you had to fight with Harvard Business Review about it is not a 4-quadrant model.
Don't remind me of that.
Yeah, sorry. Back then, you were pointing out that there's actually kind of a cliff between simple and disordered. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I don't think
well, it's actually, we now call it clear, all right? Or collectively orders between order and chaos. The reason is this is Rennie Tom's catastrophe theory. All right, so the boundaries between order, chaos, and complex are phase shifts in Cynefin. So if you can imagine, sorry, if you fold over a piece of paper, so it's like a cliff, yeah? If you walk along the top of that, you don't realize there's a cliff coming, right? And when you suddenly get there, you fall off the edge, right? So it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, the last grain on the sand heap and stuff like that. So the point being made there is if you create a highly ordered structured system, and the context has changed. So when you created the approach, it worked, but now the context has changed. Because people will conform with the process because you have too much authority, you end up falling off the edge to chaos. All right. So one given illustration, sometimes you can also call this a Kodak moment. So that links in with my other main framework, which is the fractious curves one. Is Kodak was so good at film and so profitable from film, even though they invented digital, they couldn't see it coming. So that order, and this is what Clayton Christensen, who I work with a lot, all right, what he called competence-induced failure. So if you over-structure a system, when the system fails, it fails catastrophically. Yeah, so that's the reason for the cliff.
Awesome, great. Joshua?
Hi, Dave. Hi. Thank you for your work and being here today. And yeah, you've helped me to do a lot of thinking. And so thank you. I have a question. We had Ria Beck was here, but there's a lot of she was talking about collective presencing and I guess collective insight practices. The state of, I guess, presence or through meditation or coming to a state of presence, how would that fit into your model of?
I get really irritated by this, all right? So I still have a copy of Ignatius Loyola's Spiritual Exercises by my desk, all right? From when I was a trainee Jesuit. I've taught meditation, yeah? The trivialization of this in things like the presencing issue and well-being really pissed me off. Yeah, so there's a huge value to meditation, right? But it's a discipline and it's training. It's not something that can be thrown together quickly, right? And also it's not necessary for change. You cannot achieve organizational change simply by everybody being present or going into some sort of mindful state. And I link this in with what I'm talking about a lot at the moment on several podcasts, is there is a North American, Northern European problem, yeah? And particularly North Americans, they find Buddhism and they accommodate it into an American leadership model. So they focus on the guru. You see this with Ken Wilber and people like that, which is that's the nutty end of this, right? I sometimes call that faux Buddhism, right? And they do it, it's a power grab, right? And you see it in organizations. The reality is, if you work on, I've done a lot of work in indigenous communities, you don't see anything like that. You act, then you talk. The North American, Northern European tradition has been to talk in order to act. And I think we need to move that the other way around. All right. So if you look at the work we're doing at the moment in North America on post-election conflict resolution, where we got young people acting as ethnographers to their communities, gathering stories, identifying patterns in those stories where we have common problems between red and blue, and then put in asymmetric red-blue teams to work on those problems. We're allowing the political conversation to happen as they work together. We're not bringing them in a workshop to meditate on what that problem is. Okay? So you're allowing the conversations to happen when people are ready for it. So I'm being a bit extreme, all right, but I think people like Peter Senge and Otto Scharmüller are neo-colonialists. What they want everybody to be like them, right? And all of that is deeply problematic. Well, this comes from a very narrow, specific cultural background, and it's not going to scale into other communities.
Great, thanks, Dave. So Rafael, then Christiana. Rafael.
Hello, Dave. Hello, everyone. My question is a bit more about the invitation. It's like it's when we invite someone to play and start reframing labels and position that are part of the identity. How do we keep an ethical concern in this invitation that respect what we are about to destroy?
I mean, I've just wrote about a few months ago an article which said, and this was for ITEL, which said no software engineer should be allowed out without training in ethics, because what they're doing with software at the moment has massive implications. So I think ethics are a key part of what we start and do. And coming back to the previous question, I think the whole mindfulness movement, the whole culture movement in organizational change is a priori unethical because it's trying to change people. All right, so it's saying you need to think like this, or we need you to have this, and I don't find that okay. I think it's perfectly legitimate in an organization to define interactions, and changing interactions changes identity far more than sort of other types of programming. So I think you need to address what you can do. So if somebody's joined an organization, it's perfectly legitimate to say we need you to work with these people for 3 months on this project. Yeah. There's nothing unethical about asking for that, provided they've got a minimum level of competence. But there's a huge amount of ethical issue in saying, please come into this room because we're going to have this deep discussion about what sort of culture we have, and we need you all to have this mindset. I'm very, very dubious about that process. Yeah. And we've also seen it, give you another story on this. So we did work in the north of England with what are called blue light services. So these are police and fire officers and ambulance drivers. It was a narrative-based abductive research project. And we found the principal factor behind mental breakdown wasn't the job, it was actually the health and safety regulations. So the health and safety regulations have been produced on the assumption that life was in the middle of a normal distribution. Whereas for these guys, they were mostly in the tails of a Pareto distribution. So the safety rules didn't really cover it. Yeah. And there was one horrendous story we got of a fire officer. They arrived at a pond in winter. A kid had run in after its dog because his dog had fallen into the ice, and the kid had run onto the ice, fallen into the pond. Fire service got there. They had to do a risk assessment, and they needed another tender. In the time that tender was coming out, the kid died. Yeah, so they followed the rules, and the guy can't live with himself anymore. Yeah. Now, when I went with these findings to the principals, they said, you weren't here to come up with that conclusion. You were here to actually say that we needed to run a mindfulness program for all our staff. Because if we run a mindfulness program, we dealt with the mental health issue. Okay? And you see the same with CBT. You know, it's sort of, we'll run this program, which is addressing a symptom, but we won't deal with the underlying cause in terms of the way it works. Yeah. So I'm being a little extreme to make a point here, but I think the whole trust permission thing you have to work out what's the legitimate area of your ability to do that. And it's not about what's in people's heads.
Thank you, Dave. Christiana.
Which, by the way, is also one of my big objections to Sharmaga and Sengi. They're trying to change people, yeah, into something which is culturally like them. And I have a real issue with that.
Okay, Christiana. You're muted. Yeah.
I just realized I was muted. Hello, I am Christiana, and I am speaking from southern Greece, and I am dealing with the problem of regenerating an empty village and making it into a productive village, but with a regenerative mindset. That's kind of my work. I wanted to ask you one practical thing. When you go to communities that they're not English speaking, how do you communicate with the locals? How do you do your work? How do you face the language barrier?
Okay, so first of all, you have solidarity from me on that. I come from Wales, and we have villages which are now entirely holiday homes, where the schools have been destroyed, the language has been destroyed, the economy has been destroyed, and local people just can't afford the homes anymore. And back when I was young, people I knew and everybody knew they were started to burn down holiday homes. I mean, the decision was, and everybody knew this, that if they ever killed somebody or hurt somebody, everybody would tell the police about them. But as long as they just did the property, and that's a real issue worldwide at the moment, right? Become worse with COVID. I think the secret, we work in people's own language. So, for example, the work we do on, and if you want to talk about this, we'd happily give you some of the facts. What we're doing is getting young people in those communities to gather stories in their own language from those communities. And then we're using things called transgenerational pairs. So young people sit down with older people, look at the stories and say, what could we do to create more stories like these and fewer like that? And if they come up with something good, they get put in a trio with somebody in government who can make it happen, right? And what we're trying to do is not just the language issue, we're trying to remove external facilitation from the process completely. All right, so that what actually comes out of the thing is authentic to that particular community. And we're just releasing a new version of the software, by the way, which uses symbols, not text.
Wow.
Because in some communities, using symbols, particularly in a Greek Orthodox community, right? Because you've got a culture which really understands the role of semiotics, all right? Like very few other cultures do. So starting to use semiotics to index can even be even more valuable because people get insight.
Great.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. The question that I had is just moved into a second place. So I will let others speak. And if I have time, then I'll ask you the next one. But I think you covered me very, very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Christian and Dave. Great. So Kenan.
So David, the example that you gave about the firefighter or whatever the rescue person was and the boy that drowned under the ice, I had been thinking about and had been looking through the Cynefin topology around some persistent issues in policy or actually outcome and structure in the sciences. And for some bizarre reason, I was first mapping it in the chaotic region, which actually made no sense. But I think it's because it creates so much chaos that I was mismapping it completely. But I realized that it belonged over very much something you're pointing to, even with the triads that you just spoke of, which is the actual structure that's holding it in place. And structure is usually, in my mind, both policy and culture. And so the policy aspect of it is one that if you're trying to address it at that individual level, which you've also been speaking about quite a bit, you'll never change it. The person's having to respond to the outside conditions and the response that will happen no matter how much they've, changed or become insightful or want to do things differently. So where do you put policy and how what are the different ways that you found yourself interacting in that space?
Okay, so let me give you some examples, all right? I got a standing ovation at the Welsh Nurses Conference 2 years ago. So I was doing a big keynote on NHS and medicine and stuff like that. And I said to the civil servants, is it okay if I'm controversial? And they said, no problem, we welcome it. I don't think they did at the end of it. But one of the things I said is, from the ethnography we've done, every single one of you breaks the rules 3 times a day on average to provide empathetic care to patients. And you risk your own jobs because you join the nursing profession to care for patients, not to follow arbitrarily based rules. Yeah. So I think on the positive side, and I've seen that in lots of places, human beings actually will break policy. Yeah. The trouble is they do it at their own risk. Yeah? So one of the things we're starting to do now, first of all, the EU Field Guide has been really useful on getting context by policymakers now, because it's that government-based endorsement of complexity. So that's important. Yeah. And one of the things Cynefin does is it doesn't say what you're currently doing is wrong. It says it's right within boundaries. So for example, on the health and safety side, we now have policy determinants which says if these conditions apply, you can break the rules. So we don't say the rules are wrong, but we say under these circumstances, you can break the rules, and then you apply these heuristics or this process. So we're creating a both and structure rather than trying to reject it. Yeah. And that's based on work that Klein and I did with the US Marines. You know, when the battlefield plan breaks down, you know, capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. If you follow those 3 rules, it's okay. And you see that in medical triage. So I think, to my mind, the work we're doing on policy is to create a both and, not an either or. And that includes measurement, right? So you will not break policymakers away from the concept of measurement. It's just too big a step. And there's nothing wrong with measurement either, but one of the things we work on is what are called vector measures. Now, vectors are measurements of direction and speed of travel for utilization of resource. And so we say if it's complex, you measure vectors. If it's complicated, you measure outcome or impact. Right? So we don't say it's wrong to measure outcome or impact, but we say if this happens, you have to measure vectors instead. All right. And this is the source data for it. So I think policy is migrating and mutating, but it does act as a constraint. The positive thing is people have learned over the ages to break the rules. And one of the things we say in Cynefin, for example, is if in the ordered domain, you know, you impose rules because that's what you should do. The more senior you are, you don't monitor it for rule infraction. Rule infraction is an indication you've got the wrong rules. And that's actually one of the indicators. I've actually built that into a dashboard for one board of the company, is the number of people breaking the expense rules. If it goes up beyond a certain level, it means your expense rules are over constrained and people are having to game the system. Now, I may not have answered the question, I've rambled around it a bit, but this concept of both and is key to complexity, or it's key to Cynefin. You know, there's nothing wrong with business process re-engineering within boundaries. But once you reach that boundary, you have to do something different on the other side.
Thank you, Dave. So we have 3 second questions for people from people who ask questions. If anybody hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet, so if you put it in the chat, we'll prioritize you. And before we go to the second questions, and we have about 15 minutes left formally, if I may ask a question, and I'm a little bit scared, of course, kind of famous Dave's criticisms. But I'm really curious to learn your honest reaction to or reflection on collective narrative as a way to sense into the group. When you prepared for this session, you had this document. It's like, how helpful was it for you to actually look at this, you know, as opposed to just coming in here and sharing something on a certain topic and then
no, it was useful because it allowed me to reflect. I mean, say it would have been more useful because I planned to spend 30 minutes reading through it, but then I couldn't get back on my computer because everything is gone or it ran out of battery, right? No, it's useful, right? And it was sort of the right length, and it gave me a sense of some of the sort of flavor of the response. So useful.
Yeah. So as a do you know any other ways or other processes that could be more useful or as useful for you to?
Well, some of the stuff we do, for example, is we get people to continuously journal during conference speeches. And we look at the way that they interpret it. So that there's other ways of capturing feedback. One thing you do know is reflective feedback is different from feedback at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that applies in all areas. So if we're doing lessons learning, and we call it lessons learning, not lessons learned, then capturing lessons as people learn them in the field, you get completely different data than if you ask people to reflect on the same thing a day later. So human beings, with the benefit of hindsight, will put more structure in place than actually existed at the time. So sort of real-time capture of material and looking for patterns in it is a big focus of complexity.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Okay, so I guess now we'll, oh yeah, Michael. Michael has a new question, please, Michael.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot of you mentioned identity before, and I don't know if it's a silly question, but what is the eternal identity you develop when you work with a lot of complexity? How do you change and internally how you see the world?
I think well, I mean, the Children's Party story basically says all human beings live with complexity on their day-to-day basis. I think it just makes you more aware of it. I think one of the key things for anybody trained in a modern management environment is complexity makes you realize, well, let me go back to this, that the origins of the word manage in English are significant here, right? So it comes from the Italian, which I will not attempt to pronounce because I always get it wrong and it's deeply embarrassing. But the Italian, which I think is menage, yeah, is the ability to ride a horse in dressage. It then gets corrupted by the French. You know, many things have been corrupted by the French, not as many as have been corrupted by the English, right? To mean household management, all right? And one of the things we say in complexity is about menage, not manage. So you're still managing, but you're managing riding a horse, which is very different from managing a household budget. And I think once people get that sort of concept, and again, it's that both and concept, in this context, I should behave differently, that makes a big difference. And we do work, for example, on Leadership 360. So we don't allow anybody to evaluate a leader. That's always a mistake, right? I mean, I got into trouble with IBM HR because I set up a website where people could volunteer to be people's third quartile negative responder so that we could game the system, right? What we do instead is you nominate a group of people. Every time they do something with you, they record that experience. And then they interpret that experience onto a series of triangles, all of which have got positive qualities. They can't say anything negative about you. And one of them says the leader's behavior was altruistic, assertive, analytical. And then you look at the pattern, you can say, oh my God, I'm all assertive, analytical. I've got very little altruism. So you can click on the altruism ones and you can say, what can I do tomorrow to create more like these and fewer like those? Or you can sit down with your staff. So we're providing that micro level immediate feedback to change the way that people perceive themselves. And that's one of the most valuable tools we put together in. Cool. Yeah, no evaluation. The key thing on complexity is you want to describe, not evaluate. Because if you describe, you see more patterns than if you evaluate.
Great, thank you, Dave. Dave, Zen, you're muted.
There we go. Dave, thanks so much for joining the group, being available. The brilliance you share is it's amazing and quite corroborative. Now, my question is, we're in a different world because of COVID now. How do you find the COVID challenge in a both and framework regarding the narrative, the science, and side effects? And are you involved in those conversations on a larger scale?
Yeah, and on a rather depressing think tank, which meets every week with some very senior people in the States and Singapore and elsewhere. And I'm considered one of the optimists on the group. But we have a clear consensus that COVID will not finish. Yeah, well, yeah, because you can't vaccinate the world. You've got something. I mean, if I ever didn't, I'm getting that quite tempted to believe in Gaia theory. Yeah, Mother Earth has had enough, and she's destroying this rather irritating parasite that she's put up with for years. Right?
Yeah.
But the reality is, we're going to get multiple mutations on that, and by the time we get that sorted out, there are bacteria thawing out in the Siberian tundra that we got no natural resistance to. So we are going to live at least for the next few decades, all right, assuming other things don't happen, in a situation where, although it may not be as extreme, but we'll get these waves of continuous crisis, right? Now, that from a complexity point of view is much easier to handle than from a systems thinking point of view. Because in a complexity perspective, we're saying, I mean, this is what Cynefin means, the origin of the word, yeah? It literally translates as habitat, but nobody in the world in Wales would describe it like that, right? It means the place of your multiple belongings. It's a very dynamic word.
Right.
It means you're there's all these interweaving threads of your past and your potential futures, and you're having to surf them. It's like whitewater kayaking. So it's not the same as the German Heimat, although some people confuse that, which is a nostalgic looking back. Yeah, in Wales, that's Hiriaeth, right? So Cynefin is a concept which says we have to manage a flow, and there'll be fluctuations in that flow. So I think that's what we're trying to look at on a world level, right? Now you are getting rural redistribution. We are getting into hybrid working. We're now starting to realize the limitations of that. Melbourne is actually quite sensible. I mean, more than anything, they've realized they have to be able to lock down the city for 3 days while they contact trace. Then they can open it up. So we're going to get much more sophisticated about this, right? But the reality is we're going to live in a world of constant increasing crises. All right. So yesterday in the Midwest, 3 states reached a temperature which was just short of the temperature where you will die if you're not in air conditioning. Okay. Now we know that that is going to happen within the next 20 years across the whole of Indonesia and the rest of the states. What's going to happen then? All right. So we need to be getting civil society ready for this so it stays civil. And so a breakdown of civil society is still one of the most likely scenarios.
Thank you, Dave. Great.
How would you see that the negotiation process or the co-sensing process with the potential youth narratives being an aspect of how to deal with that?
That's what we're doing. I mean, I'm in discussions with the European community at the moment about moving the software in as part of the baccalaureate. So we've had this vision for some time about every child at the age of 16 in every school in the world acting as ethnographer to their own community to create a sensing network, which actually is better than the internet. The internet is an unbuffered feedback loop. So this is buffered by human interpretation. Sure. And when I first put the proposal together 6 years ago, I said, if we ever have a major pandemic, we'll need something like this, because you need real-time feedback loops at a highly localized level, because actually attitudes matter. So for example, on the hill above where I live, there's a plague village, right? So in the medieval plagues, the villagers realized somebody had the plague, so they locked the gates and didn't allow anybody out, and everybody died. But it didn't spread. All right. Whereas other people ran from London because they could afford to and went to their country estates and took the plague with them. So the ability to measure which communities have got cohesion and which haven't. And then this is called fractal engagement, to do different things at different levels based on real-time context. That sort of thing is going to be really important.
Great, thank you, Dave. So we have time for one more question, and that will be Joshua. And after that, we'll have closing remarks. So Joshua, your question is popular. People are supporting it on the chat. So please go ahead. One moment. Yeah. I'm trying to unmute you. Okay, go to.
Dave, you said that rewilding is a term that you like to use or to think about. How do you picture that rewilding in complex social systems? So it's not like the rewilding and they're just getting chaotic and breaking down, like in the example that you just gave.
I mean, people need to remember, rewilding doesn't mean a return to the wild. It means restoring balance. And that's really important to understand. So it's, you know, the famous case is they reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone, right? And the waters run clean again. That actually only worked because an indigenous group were prepared to reintroduce wolves on their land. Yeah, because they didn't have that sort of fear, right? So one of the things we're doing in organizations, for example, by formalizing the process of generating informal networks across silos, is we're rebalancing the system. So for the last 20 or 30 years, and systems thinking has been entirely responsible for this because of its engineering metaphor. It's tried to make everything into a formal structure process to remove human judgment. So by strapping that back and creating systems where you have distributed capability for validation of human judgment is one way to rewild. So one of the key lessons we got on the field guide is you centralize coordination, you distribute decision-making. But you don't just distribute decision-making to individuals, we have decisions made in diverse trios. So there's a check and a balance point within the system. So we create mechanisms by which trust is a part of the system. It doesn't require people to be trustworthy, yeah? And that's partial transparency. Full transparency is actually quite dangerous. So that there's a lot of individual tools and techniques to do on this, yeah? But you can fairly simply get balance back into systems. Yeah, the interesting thing is military do this anyway. I do an awful lot of work with military, and which is weird because I come from a Welsh socialist background who regarded military as evil fascists. And now I spend a lot of my time in Quantico, and my most treasured gift is a little jar of sand from Ujimba, yeah, which they gave me. Military are fascinating because they're not actually hierarchical. They are hierarchical, but the hierarchy dissolves at need and reforms in different ways. So, for example, a sergeant can have authority over a general in some contexts. And they have principles about when rules break, and they actually train more because they know things are going to go wrong. So I do a lot of work to look at what's evolved in military environments over the last 4 or 5 centuries, and then adapt and to get the theory of that, move it sideways into industry. Yeah, and the informal networks are actually part of it. The reason they have messes is that builds informal networks, which you then rely on in crisis. And it was quite interesting, Mrs. Seidlin, on this. Robin Dunbar, Dunbar's number, one of the numbers on that, which is critical, is that if a society reaches more than about 5 million, it loses cultural cohesion. And there are various scientific reasons for that. And I've been arguing in Singapore for years, they shouldn't go above 5 million because they'll get problems. Yeah, and finally won that argument. But one of the things that Singapore has, it handled COVID really very well. One of the reasons is every civil servant did 3 years of military service. And they don't get to be senior civil servants unless they reach major level within the Singapore Army. So they got these dense, meritocratic, informal networks. If you come to the UK, and at the moment the UK has got a government which is at Latin American levels of corruption, then the informal networks are people who went to 2 or 3 schools who are already in the elite. So they're not meritocratic networks. So they lack diversity. So that's an unbalanced system. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, David. So this is the end of the Q&A section. That was very rich. Thank you so much. That's awesome. And it's time for closing remarks. So Dave, anything you want to leave us with as a general advice or general reflection, and any announcements you might have for those who will watch the recording.
There's a phrase which Gregory Bateson used and also Ackoff used, if I go back to 2 of the original. They said the difference that makes a difference. People are too afraid to make differences between things. Yeah, they don't want to oppose something. They want everything to, you need to make a difference, all right? In order to make a difference, you need to have differences. That's kind of like the gradient point, right? The stuff I've talked about on schools and sports clubs and religious groups, we're going to have that available in a month or so on the website, so that in not just as national initiatives, but as school themselves could take them down and choose to use them. Yeah. So we're starting to create some public good stuff around that. And that's all on the website. So it's worth keeping an eye on it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dave. That was a wonderful session. Thank you, everybody. The session is officially complete. As always, we'll keep the room open for 10 minutes or so for informal chat if you want to stay. But we're done now for today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you.
Everybody who needs to go, have a great day. And that's awesome. Good. Yeah, so let me stop the recording. Yeah, stop the recording.